Perhaps the greatest failure of Reconstruction was the issue of race relations. Now, there are certainly some advancements. For example, we got rid of slavery in Reconstruction. It's the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, promised equal rights and equal protection under the law. 15th Amendment is supposedly protecting the rights to vote for African Americans. There were civil rights acts on the books, like the one in 1866 and another one in 1875. That one said that states could not discriminate in public accommodations, like restaurants, hotels, etc. The point is that it looked like a lot of advancement, but in a relatively short amount of time, after Reconstruction, what happened to blacks in the United States? They wound up rigidly segregated, totally discriminated, and disfranchised. Well, how can you do that? Constitutional amendments and laws, and yet African Americans wound up in a second-class system at best. Well, what you have to do is interpret away the laws and the amendments through the courts. So race relations was the biggest failure in terms of Reconstruction goals. The downward spiral of black civil rights is certainly going to continue in the 1880s and into the 1890s. For example, the Supreme Court in the 1880s are going to start hearing the civil rights cases, particularly about accommodations, the segregation of these accommodations. And what it's going to rule is a public accommodation that's segregated, it's done not by state action, but actually by individual actions. Therefore, it does not violate the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says nothing about an individual who discriminates. So you can see how they are going to interpret away a law or even a constitutional amendment. Do you suppose that the state, however, had anything to do with licensing of such places like hotels and restaurants? Of course they did, but that's overlooked. So civil rights cases in the Supreme Court are going to basically allow for discrimination. The big one is going to come in the 1890s, particularly 1896, when the Supreme Court hands down one of the most infamous cases it ever heard. In Plessy versus Ferguson, it's going to rule that separate but equal is actually constitutional. As long as you have separate facilities for blacks and whites, and they are of equal quality, that's not unconstitutional. And pretty soon, it's going to spread. It'll spread into schools, bathrooms, railroad cars. Even Bibles that black and white witnesses are going to be sworn in upon are going to be segregated. Bibles. Is that segregated enough for you? Segregation, therefore, becomes the rule in the 1890s. When it comes to the right to vote, blacks voted in the 1890s, despite the fact there was a lot of intimidation against it. Their right to vote was not going to be taken away until the end of the 1890s. For example, in that decade, there was considerable falling out amongst the poor and rich whites of the South. And when there's a falling out between whites, guess what both parties did when it comes to blacks being concerned? They appealed to black voters, and they cheated. Pretty soon, they just said that we just need to take away the right to vote for the black population, and at least it would therefore be a fair fight. Now, what did the Constitution say? It said that you cannot deny a person's right to vote due to their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, it doesn't say anything about denying the right to vote based on literacy or paying a tax. So in states like Mississippi, the state started beginning to put literacy tests, also known as poll taxes. A literacy test is when basically a voter would come to a poll and they would read a portion of the Constitution. The literacy test was basically administered by a white person, and if a black voter came and read the Constitution perfectly, they still failed the test. However, if a white person stumbled through it, they passed. This, of course, is going to bring black voting down to almost 0% in states like Mississippi, and it was still in effect until the 1950s. The poll tax is a tax where basically you pay a small amount of money at the beginning of the year, and you receive a receipt in which it says you had paid that poll tax, right? Now, it's very hard to keep a piece of paper. I challenge you to keep a single piece of paper for an entire year. The problem is going to be that people are going to lose this receipt. And when you do that, you have to pay that tax again. Well, it's not that much, but when you consider the fact that there are so many poor people out there, they're not going to be able to pay the tax once more. So it's a good way of disfranchising people. So discrimination and disfranchisement became the rule across the South by the 1890s. On top of this, of course, you have a tremendous amount of violence aimed against blacks across the South. Texas led the way in the South. in the 1890s, almost in the 1930s, in terms of lynching. Lynching is when basically a mob takes an unfortunate victim and executes him illegally. For example, in 1930 in Sherman, Texas, there was a black man accused of raping a white woman. He was arrested, and due to the mob uproar, is going to be moved over to Gainesville for his protection. However, he had to stand trial in Sherman. Well, a month later, he's getting trial in Sherman, Texas, and the trial is held on the second floor of the courthouse. During the trial, there's going to be a heavily armed mob, a crowd of thousands that are going to surround the courthouse. And what do? They set fire to the first floor of that courthouse. The people inside gave the defendant two options: brave the crowds or be locked in a safe. And once the crowds are gone, they would remove him from the safe. Well, he chose the latter. He chose the safe. The mob would not allow fire crews to put out the fire. They would keep on cutting the fire hoses. Word went all the way down into Dallas for the National Guard to come up and put down the crowd, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Well, the courthouse burns to the ground, and they find the safe. They open it up, and they find that the defendant was dead. Now, this might satisfy the vast majority of people, but not these animals. These animals actually decided to cut the man out and drag him behind the car and drive all through the black section of the town, where they would hang and burn the body in plain view. Then they set fire to the entire black business block of Sherman, Texas. No one was punished for this horrendous crime. And to this day, not many blacks live in Sherman, Texas. This went on across the South to an unfortunate high degree. Now, the question is asked, what is the black community going to do? And as we'll see in our next video, there are going to be two major answers that are going to come forth.